September 1940-4. The skies over western France have become a graveyard for the Third Reich. For Major General Botho Henning Elster, the war is no longer about conquest or glory. It has distilled down to a terrifying singular calculus of survival. I want you to pause and imagine the crushing weight resting on the shoulders of this one man, holding the lives of nearly 20,000 soldiers. These are not just faceless statistics on a staff map. They are 20,000 breathing, frightened human beings, fathers, sons, and husbands, who are watching the horizon with dread. To his front, the landscape is dominated by the dust and roar of General George S. Patton's Third Army, a force of speed and violence that has already severed every escape route to the fatherland. To his rear, hundreds of miles away in the burning ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler is screaming orders that are completely detached from reality. The Führer has decreed that any commander who surrenders is a traitor. Thanks to the ruthless laws of Sippenhaft or kin liability, the punishment falls not just on the officer, but on his wife and children back home. One step forward into the American guns means annihilation. One step backward means the executioner's block for his family. When honor becomes a suicide pact and survival becomes treason, what does a professional soldier do? This is not merely a story about a battle won or lost. It is the story of one of the most perplexing, yet strategically brilliant moments of World War II. It is the story of Wige or Jess, Patton, known as Old Blood and Guts, a man who lived for the offensive and despised weakness, would choose to offer unprecedented protection and honor to a German general. The answer begins on the muddy banks of the Loire River during a suffocating autumn that would test the limits of military logic. By mid-September 1940, for the situation for German forces had gone from precarious to catastrophic. Following the breakout from Normandy in August, the Allied advance moved with a velocity that shocked even the most optimistic American commanders. The defensive lines of the Third Reich were sliced through like a hot knife through butter. Supply lines were severed, communication hubs were smoking ruins, and entire German armies were left writhing like snakes with broken backs. General Elster found himself in the eye of the storm. The force under his command was a strange ragtag anomaly of war. Of the nearly 20,000 men marching with him, few were elite combat troops. There were no hardened panzer divisions, here no fanatical SS units ready to die for the cause. Instead, this column was the debris of occupation sailors without ships and Luftwaffe ground crews with no planes to service. They were clerks, bakers, administrative staff, and horse-tended supply units. They were men trained to file paperwork and maintain order in quiet French towns, not to fight a mobile war against American armored columns. Yet 20,000 rifles, fueled by the courage of the desperate, could still unleash a terrible bloodbath. But reality was closing in. They were stranded in the south of France, separated from the German border by hundreds of miles of hostile territory and the entirety of Patton's army. Standing by the banks of the Loire, watching the gray water flow past, Elster knew he faced three choices. And as he analyzed them, he realized that every single one was a one-way ticket to hell. Option 1 was the choice demanded by Nazi ideology: fight to the last man. Try to break out to the east, paving the road with corpses. In the propaganda broadcast from Berlin, this was called glorious sacrifice. In the eyes of a professional officer like Elster, it was called murder. His column was a slow-moving target. They had almost no heavy artillery, no air cover, and were running on fumes. Against the absolute air superiority of the U.S. Army Air Forces, these 20,000 men would be turned into hamburger meat within hours. American P-40-7 Thunderbolts were already prowling the skies, waiting to tear his soft-skinned vehicles to shreds. To order an attack was not military strategy, it was a crime against his own men. Option 2 was to dissolve the army, break the 20,000 men into small groups, and tell them to scatter into the French countryside to fight a guerrilla war. This sounded like a way to buy time, but Elster knew better. By September 1940, for the French resistance, the FFI was everywhere. After 4 years of brutal occupation, the French were thirsty for revenge, hunting down any small group of German soldiers without mercy. That left the third option, the option that was strictly forbidden, the word that could get you shot in 1940 for surrender. We have to understand that in the context of late 1940 for surrender was not as simple as raising a white flag. For a German general, capitulation required more courage than dying in battle. The Nazi grip on the military had become paranoid and psychotic. The order was stand and die. If Elster surrendered, he was not just risking his career, he was risking the lives of his family. The Gestapo's policy of collective punishment was not a bluff. They would hang the families of traitors. But Elster was not a Nazi fanatic. He was a traditional Prussian officer. In the modern world, that distinction might seem blurry, but in 1940 for it was everything. A Nazi party member served the Führer, a Prussian officer served the state and his men. Elster made his choice. He would not sacrifice them on the altar of Hitler's delusions. He had to save them. However, the logistics were a tactical nightmare. If they simply threw down their weapons in an open field, they might be massacred by the French resistance or strafed by aircraft. He needed a guarantee. He needed a partner in this dance. He needed to ensure this surrender was treated as a formal military operation. He needed to ensure his men would be treated as prisoners of war, not war criminals to be lynched by the angry mobs. And so one of the most surreal negotiations of World War II began. Elster dispatched a liaison officer driving a vehicle marked with a white flag. The message he carried was audacious. Elster essentially said, "I have 20,000 men, I am willing to surrender, but I have conditions." It sounds absurd, doesn't it? A defeated general trapped in hopeless, dictating terms to the conquerors. But this was Elster's genius and his deep insight into the psychology of his enemy. He wasn't asking for money or freedom. He demanded that the surrender be conducted with the pomp and circumstance of a grand military ceremony with full honors. He demanded that his officers be allowed to keep their sidearms until the final moment of the official surrender ceremony. Most importantly, he demanded that they surrender only to the Americans, specifically to Patton, not to the French. This audacious request traveled up the chain of command until it landed on the desk of General George Patton himself. Now, history often paints Patton as a caricature with pearl-handled revolvers, the cigar, the profanity, and the slap. We think of him as a warrior who only understood violence. You might expect Patton to laugh at the request of Elster. After all, the point of war is to destroy the enemy, and here was a massive German target sitting in the open field. But the real George Patton was far more complex. He was a historian, a scholar of warfare, and a deep strategic thinker. When he reviewed Elster's proposal, the atmosphere in his headquarters was tense and his staff officers were furious. "General, why should we negotiate with Nazis?" they argued. "We can crush them, and negotiating is an insult to our boys." To them, unconditional surrender meant exactly that: no deals, no conditions, just the total and absolute submission. Patton, however, looked past the emotion and saw the cold, hard logic of the battlefield and his ultimate mission. Yes, he could order the attack, and his tanks and aircraft could wipe the German column off the face of the earth. But at what cost? It would take days and consume thousands of gallons of gasoline needed for the race to the border. It would expend tons of ammunition, and most importantly, American soldiers would die in the process of the battle. Even a trapped rat bites, and 20,000 trapped rats could kill hundreds of American boys before the end of the conflict. Patton realized that Elster was offering him a strategic gift. German propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, had been screaming. They claimed that Americans were barbarians and gangsters who would torture, castrate, and enslave every single German prisoner. This fear was the glue holding the crumbling Wehrmacht together. Patton realized that if he accepted this surrender and turned it into a public spectacle of chivalry and discipline, he would drive a stake through the heart of that propaganda. He would show the German army that surrendering to the Americans was not a death sentence, but a ticket to survival. He would prove that the Americans were professionals who respected the laws of war. defying the instincts of his subordinates. Patton approved the show. He sent word back to Elster. "The conditions are accepted. Prepare your men for the ceremony. We will treat you with the honors of war." This was not an act of mercy. It was an act of supreme military calculation. Patton was about to stage a piece of theater that would save thousands of American lives. But for Elster, the hardest part began. He had secured safety for his men, but in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant in the eyes of his country. On the morning of September 16, 1940, for at the Beaugency Bridge history held its breath in anticipation. If you had stood on those banks, you would not have witnessed the chaotic shuffling procession of a broken army. Instead, you would have seen something that bordered on the surreal. From the mist emerged column after column of troops. They were marching in perfect cadence. They had spent the previous night not in despair but in careful preparation. Officers marched at the head of their units, medals glinting on their chests, and their heads were held very high indeed. This did not look like a march into captivity. It looked like a victory parade through the famous Brandenburg Gate. This spectacle was by design. It was the physical manifestation of the deal struck between General Elster and Patton. The psychological impact on the American soldiers waiting on the other side of the bridge was absolutely profound. Their fingers hovered over the triggers of their Thompson submachine guns, but their eyes were wide with disbelief. They had been told they were fighting monsters, brainwashed fanatics who would bite on scratch until the very end. But here, walking towards them, was a force that radiated an eerie disciplined dignity that they could not ignore. This refusal to dissolve into a mob was exactly what Elster intended, and it was exactly what Patton had gambled on. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of military theater as General Elster approached the center of the bridge. Waiting for him was Major General Robert Macon of the United States 83rd Infantry Division, representing Patton. Under the gaze of newsreel cameras and thousands of silent soldiers, Elster unbuckled his service pistol slowly. He did not throw it in the dust, and he did not hand it over with a trembling hand or any sign of weakness. He presented it grip first to General Macon. The American general accepted the weapon with a sharp salute. In that singular moment, a silent agreement was sealed, and there was no humiliation or any triumphant shouting. It was a transaction between professionals who understood the men on the ground were bound by a code of conduct. Patton's strategy was working. By allowing the Germans to keep their dignity, he was stripping them of their will to fight. Consider the French civilians watching from the ruined streets. These people had lived under the jackboot for 4 long years. Many had come to the bridge hoping to see the master race broken and bloodied. They wanted to see them begging for their lives. Instead, they saw an army that remained an army. The discipline meant there was no looting or last-minute atrocities by soldiers. The orderliness of the surrender actually protected French villages just as much as it protected the captured German soldiers. The mob violence that often accompanied liberation was stifled by the sheer weight of military prot, a coloned professional conduct. Behind this facade of chivalry lay a terrifying reality for General Elster. He was physically safe for the first time. He drank real coffee and slept in a bed without fear of strafing runs. Yet, in the eyes of his own nation, he was a dead man. News of the surrender reached Berlin with the speed of a shockwave. Adolf Hitler was apoplectic when he heard about the bridge. The Nazi hiked him and saw this not as a rational preservation of manpower, but as the ultimate betrayal of the German people. A military tribunal was convened. Botho Henning Elster was found guilty of cowardice and high treason in a sham trial. He was sentenced to death. The Gestapo began to look for his family. Elster was safest in the hands of his mortal enemies. This paradox reveals the schizophrenia of the German military. On one side, the suicidal fanaticism demanded by the party. Elster had chosen the latter. He knew the consequences. He knew his name would be dragged through the mud back in Germany. But he also knew that 20,000 men would wake up the next morning. Let us go back to the strategic calculation of Patton. Why did he allow this? Was it just nostalgia for a bygone era of gentlemanly warfare? Absolutely not. He was a realist. Patton was a pragmatist of the highest order. He knew the war in the West still had many long months or years to run. There were still hundreds of thousands of German troops dug into the Siegfried Line for a final bloody confrontation. If every single one of them fought with the desperation of a rat in a trap, the cost in blood would be astronomical. Patton needed a billboard. He needed a public advertisement to show exactly what surrender to Americans looked like. By treating Elster's 20,000 men with such public respect, he was broadcasting a message to every commander. Look at this. You do not have to die for Hitler. You do not have to be torn apart by our superior, Allied artillery. If you lay down your arms, you will be treated like men. This psychological weapon was more effective than any bomb. In the weeks and months that followed, American intelligence officers noted a significant shift in enemy behavior. German units began to surrender in larger numbers, citing the treatment of Elster's column as a deciding factor. They knew the Americans kept their word and that surrender was not a trick to lead them into a slaughterhouse. Patton had turned a tactical event into a strategic victory. He had successfully used mercy as a weapon of war now. General Elster survived the war in American captivity far from the execution squads in the ruins of the fatherland. He spent the remaining months of the conflict in a POW camp in the United States, safe from the SS and the Gestapo. When the war ended, he returned to a Germany that was unrecognizable after years of total and absolute destruction. He faced further scrutiny, first from Allied denazification panels and later from the newly formed German government. He had to justify his actions again and again. People asked if he was a coward or if he had failed his military duty. But history and the courts eventually sided with him. Continuing to fight in September 1944 was criminal. Fighting without heavy weapons air support or hope of relief would have been an act of extreme criminal negligence. The supposed cowardice was in fact moral courage. It takes bravery to holster a weapon when everyone expects fire. It takes specific bravery to accept the label of traitor just to save the lives of 20,000 innocent people. 20,000 men he saved finally went home. They rebuilt Germany and raised families in a new era of peace. They lived because one man had the foresight to see through Nazi ideology and make a rational choice for survival. They lived because another man, George Patton, had the strategic wisdom to accept that difficult and unique choice. Looking back at the footage of endless lines of soldiers walking across the bridge, we remember a complex truth. The binary choice of kill or be killed is not always the only way. Sometimes peace is the most effective strategy. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones where the guns remain silent and human lives are preserved for history. Elster and Patton, the defeated and the victor, played high-stakes poker over human lives. In the end, they both won. Patton cleared his flank and sped his advance without losing a man. Elster saved his army from total annihilation. In the blood-soaked chronicle of war, this story stands out clearly as a rare beacon of human sanity. It is a testament to the idea that even in the midst of total war, professionalism and humanity can still dictate history. This was the day the killing stopped, not because of a lack of ammunition, but because of an abundance of profound wisdom. And that is a lesson that echoes far beyond the banks of the Loire River, reminding us of the power of rational choices. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, then smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer. I will see you on the next battlefield as we uncover more hidden stories from the past.